The San Francisco Bay Area was once crowned with some of the grandest private residences ever built in the United States. Hills that are now crowded with apartments, offices, and traffic were once dominated by towering mansions of stone, brick, and carved wood. These homes rivaled European palaces in scale and craftsmanship, surrounded by manicured gardens, private roads, and staffed by dozens of servants. They were built by men who believed their wealth was permanent and their names would endure forever. Yet today, most of these mansions are gone. In this exploration of the forgotten Gilded Age mansions of the San Francisco Bay Area, we uncover where they stood, who built them, how they lived inside them, and why so little remains. If you're fascinated by lost architecture, vanished estates, and the hidden layers of American history, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss future episodes. Now, let's step back into a Bay Area that no longer exists. To understand how these mansions came to dominate the landscape, we need to begin with the explosive rise of San Francisco itself. Everything changed in 1848 with the discovery of gold in the Sierra Nevada foothills. Almost overnight, San Francisco transformed from a quiet port into the financial heart of the American West. Ships packed the bay, businesses multiplied, fortunes were made at a pace the world had never seen. By the late 19th century, wealth in San Francisco no longer came only from gold. Railroads, shipping, banking, mining, and real estate generated vast fortunes for a small group of industrialists and financiers. Like their counterparts in New York and Europe, these men used architecture to display power, stability, and social dominance. The house was no longer just a home. It was a public statement. Nowhere was this more visible than Nob Hill. Once lightly developed, Nob Hill became the most prestigious address in the city. Its elevation offered sweeping views of the bay and physical separation from the crowded streets below. Here, railroad barons and financiers built massive mansions in Victorian, Gothic, Italianate, and eclectic revival styles. These were homes with dozens of rooms, soaring stair halls, private art galleries, ballrooms, conservatories, and hidden service corridors designed to keep staff out of sight. The mansion built by Mark Hopkins, one of the leaders behind the Central Pacific Railroad, became one of the most famous examples. Rising above the city, it was conceived as a monument to success. Years were spent carving exotic woods, painting frescoed ceilings, and installing custom-built features. Visitors often compared its scale and atmosphere to that of a. By the 1890s, Nob Hill had become a physical concentration of power. The homes built there were not simply residences clustered by coincidence. They were statements placed deliberately within sight of one another. Each mansion was larger, richer, and more architecturally ambitious than the last, reflecting both cooperation and rivalry among the city's elite. Wealth was measured not only in dollars, but in elevation, square footage, imported materials, and the number of rooms that could be devoted to display rather than daily life. Inside these houses, everyday living was secondary to presentation. Guests were received in formal entrance halls designed to overwhelm from the first step. Staircases rose beneath frescoed ceilings and skylights, while walls were paneled in rare woods shipped from across the world. Dining rooms were built to accommodate dozens of guests at once, with tables extended by leaves and surrounded by carved chairs that might only be used a handful of times each year. Even private bedrooms were often larger than entire middle-class homes, filled with custom furniture, hand-woven carpets, and decorative painting that extended from floor to ceiling. Behind the scenes, a completely separate world existed. Service corridors, hidden staircases, and rear entrances allowed servants to move unseen. Kitchens were isolated for fire safety, food was transported through controlled routes, and communication systems connected rooms through call bells and speaking tubes. These houses were designed to function like machines, anticipating needs before they were spoken. Nothing was accidental. But Nob Hill was not the only place where wealth reshaped the city. As San Francisco continued to grow, Van Ness Avenue emerged as another epicenter of elite life. Around the turn of the 20th century, the avenue was regarded as the city's most fashionable street. It was wide, prominent, and highly visible, making it ideal for families who wanted their wealth on display. Mansions rose shoulder to shoulder along the avenue, creating an almost continuous wall of architectural spectacle. The styles varied dramatically. French Second Empire homes with mansard roofs stood beside flamboyant Italianate palaces and towering Queen Anne houses crowned with turrets. Eastlake detailing covered facades in intricate woodwork, while stone mansions borrowed heavily from European chateaux. Corner lots were the most prized, allowing houses to dominate intersections with height, mass, and ornament. Walking along Van Ness at its height meant passing one monumental residence after another, each attempting to outshine its neighbors. These homes were not secluded retreats. They were embedded directly into the social life of the city. Parades passed their doors. Guests arrived on foot, by carriage, or later by automobile. Windows framed public life, while interiors reflected the private rituals of high society. The houses functioned as both residences and stages, reinforcing class boundaries through architecture itself. Across the bay, a different pattern was emerging. Oakland offered something San Francisco increasingly could not: space. With new rail connections and expanding industry, Oakland became an attractive alternative for wealthy families seeking larger properties and greater privacy. Hillsides, open land, and expansive views allowed for estates that were impossible to build within San Francisco's tightening grid. Here, the Gilded Age mansion took on a different form. Instead of urban palaces, families built sprawling country estates. These properties often included dozens of acres of landscaped grounds, winding drives, gardens, pastures, and outbuildings. The house was only one component of a much larger composition designed to feel like a private world. Some estates featured observation towers overlooking the bay, greenhouses filled with exotic plants, artificial lakes, conservatories, and walking paths that disappeared into wooded areas. Groundskeepers maintained not just gardens, but entire ecosystems of deer, birds, and livestock. Staff lived on the property in cottages scattered discreetly across the land. Guests arrived slowly, passing through gates and gardens long before reaching the front door, ensuring the experience unfolded deliberately. Despite their grandeur, these estates were more vulnerable than they appeared. The first major rupture came in 1906. When the earthquake struck San Francisco, it reshaped the city in a matter of minutes. Buildings collapsed, streets cracked open, and fires quickly followed. Many of the great mansions withstood the initial shaking, only to be destroyed by the infernos that burned for days. Rich interiors filled with wood, fabric, and decorative finishes became fuel. Entire blocks of Nob Hill were erased. Van Ness Avenue, once lined with the city's grandest homes, was dynamited in a desperate attempt to stop the fires. The plan failed. The avenue was left devastated, its architectural splendor reduced to rubble. What survived the earthquake was often damaged beyond repair, and rebuilding such enormous homes no longer made sense in a changing city. Yet even beyond the disaster, the era of the Gilded Age mansion was already ending. The early 20th century brought rising property taxes, labor shortages, and shifting social values. The servant-based lifestyle these homes depended on became increasingly impractical. Maintaining a house with 40 or 50 rooms required enormous expense, and younger generations often had little interest in preserving buildings designed for a different way of life. At the same time, the Bay Area's population continued to grow. Land became more valuable than private estates. Developers saw opportunity where families saw burden. Mansions were sold, subdivided, converted, or demolished entirely. In San Francisco, apartment buildings replaced single-family palaces. In Oakland, estates were carved into residential neighborhoods. Gardens became streets. Ballrooms became floor plans. By the mid-20th century, most of these mansions had vanished. Some were lost to fire or earthquake. Others were deliberately destroyed. In several cases, the remains were buried beneath new developments, leaving no trace at street level. What survived existed mostly in photographs, drawings, and written descriptions, records of spaces that no longer exist. What disappeared with these houses was not just architecture, but an entire worldview. The Gilded Age mansion reflected confidence in endless growth, faith in personal empire, and the belief that wealth could permanently shape the landscape. Their disappearance tells a different story, one of changing priorities, economic reality, and the limits of excess. Today, the Bay Area still carries echoes of that era. Street names, neighborhood layouts, and isolated surviving buildings hint at what once stood there. Beneath modern developments lie foundations, tunnels, and fragments of a vanished world. These forgotten mansions remind us that cities are built and rebuilt not only by progress, but by memory, and by what each generation chooses to leave behind. As these mansions disappeared from the landscape, they also faded from public memory. Unlike castles in Europe, which were often preserved through monarchy or national identity, America's Gilded Age estates were tied to individual fortunes. When those fortunes fractured, the houses lost their protection. There was no cultural framework yet for preservation on a grand scale, and historic value was rarely considered until it was already too late. In many cases, the destruction was swift and intentional. A mansion that took years to design and build could be reduced to rubble in weeks. Developers viewed these structures as obstacles rather than assets. Their thick masonry, ornate interiors, and outdated layouts made renovation costly. It was often cheaper to demolish everything and start fresh. Entire neighborhoods were reimagined in the span of a decade, erasing physical reminders of the city's earlier identity. What replaced them reflected a new urban reality. Apartment buildings rose where single families once occupied entire blocks. The rise of automobiles reshaped street design. Density replaced display. Efficiency replaced ceremony. The Bay Area was no longer a place where wealth needed to announce itself through towering facades and acres of gardens. Power had become quieter, more corporate, and less personal. Yet even as these mansions vanished, the myths surrounding them grew. Stories of lavish balls, hidden passageways, and eccentric owners persisted long after the buildings were gone. Old photographs circulated, showing rooms filled with art, staircases rising into shadow, and guests frozen in time. Floor plans revealed just how immense these houses had been, with spaces dedicated to activities that no longer existed in modern homes. Conservatories, smoking rooms, music rooms, and servants' halls spoke to a way of life structured around hierarchy and spectacle. Some former mansion sites became famous in their own right, even if few people realized what once stood there. Hotels, housing developments, schools, and civic buildings quietly inherited land once reserved for a single family. In certain cases, fragments survived, retaining walls, garden staircases, or outbuildings absorbed into new uses. These remnants became unintentional monuments, often overlooked by those who passed them daily. Across the bay, Oakland followed a similar trajectory, though often with less documentation. Large estates were subdivided into residential lots, creating neighborhoods that today feel organic and established, yet were once private parks. Curving streets followed former carriage drives. Clusters of trees marked old garden boundaries. In some areas, the scale of early 20th century houses hinted at a time when wealth concentrated more dramatically on the hills. The social consequences of this shift were profound. Gilded Age mansions were built to reinforce class divisions, separating owners from workers both physically and socially. Their removal coincided with broader changes in American life. The decline of domestic service altered household structures. Middle-class homeownership expanded. Cities became places of shared infrastructure rather than private domains. The earthquake of 1906 often dominates discussions of why these mansions disappeared, but it was only one chapter in a longer story. Even without it, many of these homes were already becoming untenable. The Gilded Age itself was ending. Progressive reforms challenged unchecked wealth. Public opinion shifted. Excess was no longer admired in the same way. Architecture followed culture. By the 1920s, the idea of building a 40 or 50-room private mansion in San Francisco or Oakland seemed increasingly out of step with the times. Wealth still existed, but it expressed itself differently. New money flowed into suburban developments, vacation homes, and modernist designs that emphasized efficiency over ornament. The mansion, as a symbol, belonged to the past. Preservation efforts arrived too late for most of these houses. While some East Coast estates were saved and transformed into museums, universities, or public institutions, the Bay Area lost the majority of its grandest examples before a preservation movement gained real traction. What survived often did so by accident rather than intention. Today, interest in these lost mansions has returned, driven by historians, architects, and enthusiasts who piece together their stories from archives, photographs, and personal accounts. Digital reconstructions attempt to visualize interiors that no longer exist. Walking tours trace outlines of vanished estates through modern streets. The fascination lies not only in what was lost, but in what those losses reveal about the city's evolution. These mansions were built during a moment of extraordinary confidence. Their owners believed they were creating permanent landmarks, symbols of achievement that would endure for generations. Instead, they became temporary expressions of an era defined by rapid change. Their disappearance underscores a central truth of urban history. No structure, no matter how grand, is immune to shifting economics, values, and priorities. The Bay Area today is shaped by layers of ambition stacked atop one another. Beneath glass towers and concrete developments lie traces of Victorian woodwork, marble foundations, and forgotten gardens. The past has not vanished completely. It has simply been buried, repurposed, or reinterpreted. Remembering these forgotten Gilded Age mansions is not about nostalgia alone. It is about understanding how cities reinvent themselves, how wealth reshapes space, and how quickly symbols of power can dissolve. These homes once defined the skyline and social order of the Bay Area. Their absence defines it just as strongly now. What remains is the story, and the quiet reminder that today's landmarks, too, are temporary. As the 20th century progressed, the disappearance of these mansions quietly reshaped how the Bay Area understood itself. What had once been a region defined by private empires gradually became a landscape of shared space, dense neighborhoods, and public infrastructure. The transformation was not sudden, but cumulative, unfolding as each estate fell, was subdivided, or faded into obscurity. In San Francisco, the rebuilding after the earthquake accelerated trends that were already underway. The city needed housing, offices, and commercial space far more urgently than it needed symbolic residences for a shrinking elite. Land that had once been reserved for a single family now held hundreds of residents. Streets that once served carriages now carried streetcars and automobiles. The logic of the city shifted from display to utility. Former mansion owners faced difficult choices. Some attempted to rebuild on a smaller scale, abandoning the idea of recreating what had been lost. Others sold their land outright, recognizing that the era which had allowed such homes to exist had passed. In several cases, heirs simply could not afford the upkeep, taxes, and staffing required to maintain these properties. The house that had once represented success became a financial liability. This pattern repeated across generations. Children and grandchildren of Gilded Age builders often had different priorities and different relationships to wealth. The world they inherited was more regulated, more urbanized, and less tolerant of extreme excess. Many preferred modern homes, apartments, or residences elsewhere, leaving ancestral mansions vulnerable to neglect or sale. In Oakland and the East Bay, the shift played out more subtly but just as decisively. Estates that once felt remote were gradually surrounded by development. Roads crept closer. Utilities arrived. What had been countryside became suburb, and suburb became city. The very qualities that had made these estates desirable, privacy, space, separation, were eroded by growth. As large parcels were subdivided, new neighborhoods emerged with distinctive layouts. Curved streets followed former garden paths. Unusually large trees marked where lawns or orchards had once stood. In some cases, neighborhood names preserved fragments of the past, even as the houses themselves vanished. Residents lived atop layers of history without always realizing it. The architectural loss was immense. These mansions were showcases of craftsmanship that would be nearly impossible to reproduce today. Hand-carved woodwork, custom stone masonry, stained glass, frescoed ceilings, and ironwork created by skilled artisans represented thousands of hours of labor. Their destruction erased not only buildings, but entire bodies of work. Yet, at the time, preservation was rarely a consideration. Historic value was not widely recognized, especially in a region that defined itself by innovation and progress. Old buildings were seen as outdated rather than irreplaceable. The idea that a private residence could be culturally significant had not yet taken hold. Even when preservation became a topic of public discussion, many of these mansions were already gone. Advocacy groups formed decades too late, left with little more than photographs and written descriptions. What survived often did so because it found a new purpose, converted into schools, institutions, or public buildings before demolition became inevitable. The absence of these mansions also altered the city's relationship with wealth. In the Gilded Age, wealth was visible and architectural. It stood on hills, announced itself through gates and towers, and demanded recognition. As those symbols disappeared, wealth became more abstract. Power moved into corporations, financial systems, and invisible networks rather than physical monuments. This shift reshaped the urban experience. The city became more democratic in appearance, even as inequality persisted beneath the surface. The removal of private palaces created space for shared streets, housing, and public life. While much was lost architecturally, something else emerged in its place. Still, fascination with these lost mansions never entirely faded. Historians, architects, and enthusiasts continue to reconstruct their stories, often piecing together fragments from newspapers, personal letters, and archival photographs. Old images are studied carefully, revealing details that were once overlooked. The placement of windows, the proportions of staircases, the arrangement of rooms, all become clues to how these houses functioned and what they represented. Digital tools now allow for virtual reconstructions, offering glimpses into interiors that no longer exist. These reconstructions are not perfect, but they help bridge the gap between memory and imagination. They allow modern audiences to grasp the sheer scale of what was lost and to understand how deeply these houses shaped the social fabric of their time. Walking through the Bay Area today, traces of this vanished world can still be felt. A sudden widening of a street, an oddly placed retaining wall, or an unusually grand staircase leading nowhere may hint at a former estate. In some neighborhoods, property lines still reflect the outlines of long demolished mansions. The past lingers quietly beneath the present. These forgotten Gilded Age mansions also serve as cautionary symbols. They remind us that architecture is inseparable from economics and culture. What one generation builds as a permanent statement may be seen by the next as an inconvenience. Grandeur does not guarantee longevity. At the same time, their stories deepen our understanding of the Bay Area's identity. This region is often associated with innovation, technology, and reinvention. But long before that narrative took hold, it was a place of opulence, hierarchy, and architectural ambition. The tech campuses and glass towers of today occupy ground once claimed by Victorian palaces and country estates. The contrast is striking. Where there were once guarded gates and private gardens, there are now sidewalks, transit lines, and shared spaces. Where wealth once expressed itself through ornament and scale, it now often hides behind minimalism and efficiency. The physical city reflects these evolving values. Remembering these mansions is not about longing for the past, but about recognizing how profoundly cities change. Each era leaves its mark, then makes way for the next. The Gilded Age reshaped the Bay Area in stone and wood. Later generations reshaped it again in concrete, steel, and glass. What endures is the cycle itself. The forgotten mansions of the San Francisco Bay Area stand as reminders that even the most powerful symbols of wealth are temporary. They rise, they dominate, and eventually they disappear, leaving behind stories, fragments, and lessons embedded in the landscape. And as the city continues to evolve, future generations may one day look back at today's landmarks with the same sense of wonder and disbelief, asking how something so dominant could simply vanish. As the physical traces of these mansions disappeared, so too did the social rituals that had once defined life within them. The Gilded Age household was built around formality, hierarchy, and performance. Every room had a purpose, every movement a protocol. When those buildings vanished, the lifestyle they supported became impossible to sustain. In these houses, daily life followed a rhythm that modern audiences would scarcely recognize. Mornings began quietly, with servants already active long before the household stirred. Fires were lit, rooms aired, meals prepared, and schedules coordinated behind the scenes. The owners might pass through only a fraction of the house on a typical day, yet dozens of rooms remained ready at all times, preserved in a state of ceremonial perfection. Entertaining was central to the purpose of these mansions. Dinners, receptions, musicales, and charity events were not occasional indulgences, but obligations, tied to social standing. To host was to demonstrate relevance. A successful event reinforced one's position within elite society, while a poorly executed one could quietly diminish it. Architecture served as the backdrop for this unspoken competition. Ballrooms existed for moments that might occur only a few times each year. Art galleries displayed collections meant as much to impress as to educate. Conservatories offered controlled encounters with nature, reinforcing the idea that even the natural world could be curated. These were spaces designed less for comfort than for effect. As these mansions vanished, so did the expectation that wealth must be publicly displayed through architecture. By the mid-20th century, conspicuous domestic grandeur had fallen out of favor. Wealthy families increasingly sought privacy rather than attention. Social power shifted away from drawing rooms and into boardrooms, institutions, and political influence. This transition marked a deeper, cultural change. The Gilded Age mansion had been a physical expression of personal empire. Its disappearance signaled the rise of corporate identity over individual dynasty. Where once a single name dominated a hillside, now entire neighborhoods emerged, housing thousands rather than one family. The loss also altered how history itself was remembered. When buildings survive, they anchor stories in physical space. When they vanish, memory becomes abstract. Without walls to walk through or rooms to stand inside, the past feels distant and less tangible. This is why so many of these mansions are now known only to specialists and enthusiasts rather than the general public. Photographs play an outsized role in keeping their memory alive. Black and white images freeze moments that feel impossibly formal to modern eyes. Figures stand stiffly beneath towering ceilings. Furniture appears oversized. Details blur at the edges, leaving just enough mystery to invite speculation. These images hint at scale, but rarely capture the full sensory experience of the space. Written descriptions help fill the gaps. Contemporary accounts speak of the smell of polished wood, the echo of footsteps on marble floors, the glow of gaslight and early electricity reflecting off gilded surfaces. They describe rooms so large they seem to swallow sound, and corridors that stretched farther than expected. Together, these fragments allow historians to reconstruct not just how the houses looked, but how they felt. In some cases, memory survives through adaptation rather than destruction. A handful of former mansion sites were repurposed into institutions, schools, or public buildings. Though altered, these spaces retain echoes of their original grandeur. High ceilings, monumental staircases, and thick walls betray their origins, even when stripped of ornament. But these examples are rare. The overwhelming story of the Bay Area's Gilded Age mansions is one of absence. This absence has shaped modern perceptions of the region. Unlike cities where grand aristocratic architecture dominates the historic narrative, the Bay Area is often seen as forward-looking and unsentimental. Its built environment reflects cycles of boom and reinvention rather than long-term continuity. The loss of these mansions reinforces that identity. Yet there is a growing recognition that something valuable was lost along the way. Not simply luxury, but craftsmanship, urban texture, and a tangible connection to formative moments in the region's history. Preservation movements today operate with a sense of urgency born from past mistakes. What was once dismissed as outdated is now carefully documented, protected, and reused whenever possible. This shift in attitude comes directly from witnessing what happens when preservation is ignored. The vanished mansions serve as cautionary examples, reminding us that once a building is gone, it cannot truly be replaced. Replicas may be built, images may be studied, but the original context is irretrievable. At the same time, it is important to acknowledge the contradictions these mansions embodied. They were products of extraordinary inequality. Their construction depended on labor systems that left many behind, and their opulence stood in stark contrast to the living conditions of much of the population. Their disappearance also reflects a reckoning with those imbalances. Understanding this complexity allows us to see the mansions not as lost utopias, but as artifacts of a specific moment in American history. They tell stories of ambition, confidence, excess, and fragility. They reveal how quickly power can reshape landscapes and how quickly it can dissolve. Today's Bay Area continues to grapple with similar tensions. Wealth concentrates, housing pressures intensify, and debates over development and preservation remain unresolved. In this way, the story of the Gilded Age mansions feels surprisingly contemporary. The players have changed, but the forces at work are familiar. Beneath modern streets and buildings, traces of that earlier era remain. Foundations lie buried. Old photographs hang in archives. Names linger in unexpected places. The city is layered with past ambitions, each generation building atop the last. The forgotten mansions of the San Francisco Bay Area remind us that cities are living entities. They grow, adapt, forget, and remember. What seems permanent in one era may vanish in the next, and what is overlooked today may one day be mourned. Their stories endure not because the buildings survived, but because the questions they raise remain relevant. How should wealth shape the city? What deserves preservation? And what will future generations say about the structures we choose to build or destroy today? In remembering these vanished homes, we are not just looking backward. We are holding a mirror to the present, asking what kind of legacy is being constructed right now, often without realizing it. As time creates distance from the Gilded Age, the absence of these mansions becomes more striking than their former presence. Modern skylines rise where towers of carved stone once stood. Neighborhoods feel complete and established, yet they are missing chapters that were erased rather than forgotten naturally. This absence shapes how the Bay Area understands its own origins, often emphasizing innovation and reinvention, while overlooking the era that laid much of its economic foundation. The men and families who built these mansions believed they were securing permanence. Architecture, to them, was proof of arrival. A fortune that could be translated into masonry and ornament felt more real, more enduring, than money alone. Their homes were intended to anchor family dynasties, to be inherited, expanded, and refined across generations. But American cities operate on different rules than the Old World. Land is not fixed by aristocracy or protected by inherited titles. It is shaped by markets, population pressure, and changing values. In the Bay Area, these forces moved quickly. The very success that created Gilded Age fortunes also accelerated the growth that made such estates unsustainable. As railroads expanded and industries multiplied, land near city centers became too valuable to reserve for a single household. What had once seemed limitless suddenly felt constrained. The logic of efficiency overtook the logic of display. Housing hundreds where once only one family lived became both economically and politically inevitable. This transition fundamentally altered how wealth interacted with the city. In the Gilded Age, wealth sought visibility. It climbed hills, claimed corners, and demanded architectural distinction. In the decades that followed, wealth learned to disappear into systems, banks, corporations, investments, less tied to physical landmarks. The mansion was replaced by the office building, the institution, the anonymous asset. As a result, modern residents often move through spaces without realizing what once occupied them. A quiet residential street may have been a carriage drive. A school playground may sit atop a former formal garden. A shopping center may cover the footprint of a ballroom that once hosted hundreds. Without signage or memory, these places feel timeless, even though they are anything but. The loss of these mansions also changed the rhythm of urban life. Large estates slowed development. They created gaps in the city fabric, pockets of green and quiet amid density. When they disappeared, the city closed in on itself. Streets became more regular, blocks more uniform. The texture of urban experience flattened. Yet this flattening brought accessibility. What had been private became public. What had been exclusive became shared. The same land that once symbolized inequality now houses diverse communities. This is the paradox at the heart of the story. The destruction of beauty and craftsmanship coincided with broader access and opportunity. It is tempting to imagine an alternate history in which these mansions were preserved and adapted, becoming museums, cultural centers, or public spaces. In some cities, this occurred. In the Bay Area, the pace of change and lack of early preservation policy made it unlikely. The region valued momentum over memory. Only later did regret set in. By the time preservation became a serious concern, most of the grandest houses were already gone. The few survivors gained near-mythic status, standing as rare witnesses to an erased landscape. They are studied, photographed, and protected precisely because they are exceptions. This scarcity fuels fascination. The more that is lost, the more people want to understand it. Researchers comb through archives, piecing together addresses, owners, architects, and room descriptions. Enthusiasts trace old maps onto modern streets, identifying where facades once stood. The city becomes a palimpsest, with faint outlines of the past visible beneath the present. These efforts reveal just how ambitious the Gilded Age vision was for the Bay Area. It was not merely a frontier city flush with sudden wealth. It aspired to cultural legitimacy on a global scale. Imported materials, European architects, and international art collections were meant to place San Francisco alongside the great cities of the world. That ambition was real, even if its physical manifestations were temporary. The disappearance of the mansions does not erase that moment of confidence. Instead, it reframes it. The Bay Area's identity has always been shaped by cycles of boom and reinvention, from gold to railroads, from industry to technology. The Gilded Age was one such cycle, intense and transformative, leaving behind wealth, infrastructure, and inequality in equal measure. Understanding this era through its lost mansions provides a fuller picture of how the region became what it is today. These houses were not side notes. They were central to how power, culture, and space were organized at the time. Their absence leaves a gap that can only be filled through storytelling, and storytelling matters. Without it, the city risks becoming unmoored from its own past, defined only by what stands rather than by what once stood. Remembering the forgotten Gilded Age mansions of the San Francisco Bay Area is an act of historical recovery. It restores depth to familiar places and challenges the idea that progress requires erasure. As the region continues to grow and change, new debates emerge about density, preservation, and identity. Old questions return in new forms. How much should be saved? What deserves protection? Who gets to decide what stays and what goes? The vanished mansions offer no easy answers, but they offer perspective. They show that what feels permanent rarely is. They remind us that cities are shaped as much by what they remove as by what they build. Long after the last stone was cleared and the last garden path paved over, the legacy of these homes continues to influence the Bay Area. Quietly, invisibly, but persistently. Their stories remain embedded in the landscape, waiting to be noticed by those willing to look past the present and into the layers beneath. And in that sense, the forgotten mansions are not entirely gone. They survive in memory, in fragments, and in the enduring question of how a city chooses to remember itself. As memory fades, the spaces once occupied by these mansions take on a kind of invisibility. Without walls or towers to point to, the imagination struggles to place what once existed. The city moves on, efficient and forward-facing, while the past becomes compressed into footnotes, captions, and the occasional archival photograph. Yet the influence of those lost estates still shapes the Bay Area in subtle but enduring ways. Urban form is one of the clearest examples. Many neighborhoods developed around the boundaries of former estates. Roads curved to avoid property lines that no longer exist. Parcels were divided unevenly, reflecting the piecemeal sale of land once owned by a single family. What appears today as organic planning often traces back to decisions made more than a century ago, when wealth dictated where streets could and could not go. Even infrastructure followed these patterns. Early water lines, utilities, and transit routes were influenced by where elite families lived and how they moved through the city. Access to services was often prioritized near these enclaves of wealth, reinforcing inequalities that lingered long after the houses themselves were gone. The mansions may have vanished, but the advantages they conferred did not disappear so easily. Culturally, the loss of these homes narrowed the public's relationship with the Gilded Age. Without physical spaces to interpret, the era is often reduced to caricature: robber barons, excess, and sudden collapse. The reality was more complex. These houses were places where art was collected, music performed, and ideas exchanged. They hosted political discussions, philanthropic events, and cultural gatherings that helped shape the region's institutions. When those spaces disappeared, so too did the tangible settings for those stories. Museums and archives preserved objects, but the environments that gave them meaning were largely lost. A painting displayed in a modern gallery does not carry the same resonance as one viewed beneath the ceiling it was meant to complement. Architecture provided context, scale, and atmosphere that cannot be fully replicated. This loss has consequences for how history is taught and understood. Without surviving examples, it becomes harder to convey the sheer ambition of the Gilded Age in the Bay Area. Words like grand and opulent lose impact when detached from physical experience. The imagination fills in gaps, but rarely captures the full extent of what once stood. In recent decades, there has been a growing effort to address this gap through research and storytelling. Historians dig deeper into primary sources, reconstructing daily life within these mansions. They examine inventories, letters, and photographs to understand how rooms were used, how servants moved through the house, and how owners interacted with their surroundings. These details humanize spaces that might otherwise feel abstract. At the same time, public interest in architectural history has expanded. Walking tours, lectures, and online communities have emerged, dedicated to uncovering what the modern city conceals. Enthusiasts share maps, compare old and new photographs, and point out subtle traces that survive in the urban fabric. In doing so, they reclaim a sense of continuity that the physical city no longer provides on its own. This renewed attention also reflects contemporary anxieties. As development accelerates and housing pressures intensify, questions about preservation feel more urgent. The memory of what was lost during the Gilded Age serves as a warning. Once a building is gone, the choice cannot be undone. Regret often follows too late. Yet it is important to recognize that the disappearance of these mansions was not the result of a single mistake or moment. It was the outcome of intersecting forces: economic shifts, demographic change, natural disaster, and evolving values. Preservation competes with necessity, and cities must constantly balance memory with survival. In the Bay Area, this balance has always tilted toward reinvention. The region's identity is tied to disruption, from gold mining to technology. Each wave leaves behind infrastructure and wealth, but also erases what came before. The Gilded Age mansions were one such casualty of progress, sacrificed to accommodate new realities. Still, their stories challenge the idea that progress and preservation must be mutually exclusive. In other cities, adaptive reuse allowed grand residences to become public assets. In the Bay Area, the opportunity was largely missed. Understanding why helps inform current debates about what should be saved and how. There is also a psychological dimension to the loss. Grand architecture anchors collective memory. It provides landmarks around which stories accumulate. When those anchors are removed, history becomes harder to grasp. The past feels flatter, less textured. This can lead to a sense that the city has always been as it is now, obscuring the depth of change that shaped it. By revisiting the forgotten mansions of the Gilded Age, that depth returns. The city becomes layered again, its present inseparable from its past. Hills regain meaning. Streets acquire backstories. Ordinary places reveal extraordinary histories. This perspective does not romanticize the era or excuse its inequalities. Instead, it situates them within a broader narrative of growth, ambition, and consequence. The mansions were products of both creativity and exploitation, vision and imbalance. Their disappearance reflects society's evolving response to those contradictions. As the Bay Area faces its own era of transformation, these lessons feel increasingly relevant. New forms of wealth concentrate once again, reshaping neighborhoods and skylines. Debates over density, affordability, and cultural identity echo those of earlier generations. The choices made today will determine what future residents inherit and what they lament losing. The forgotten Gilded Age mansions remind us that architecture is never neutral. It embodies values, priorities, and power structures. When it disappears, it leaves behind questions as much as empty space. Remembering these houses is one way of engaging with those questions, even in their absence. Ultimately, the legacy of these mansions is not confined to photographs or archives. It lives on in the city's structure, its inequalities, and its ongoing tension between memory and momentum. By acknowledging what was lost, the Bay Area gains a clearer understanding of what it has become and what it might still choose to preserve. In that understanding lies the true value of these forgotten homes, not as relics of excess, but as mirrors reflecting the forces that continue to shape the city today. As the Bay Area moved further into the modern era, the disappearance of these mansions began to feel less like an isolated historical event and more like part of a repeating pattern. Each generation redefines what is useful, what is valuable, and what is worth keeping. In that process, architecture becomes both a victim and a record of changing priorities. The Gilded Age mansion was built for a world that assumed permanence. Its owners expected stable fortunes, lifelong domestic staff, and a social order that justified enormous private space. Once those assumptions collapsed, the buildings lost their purpose. A house designed to host 60 guests for dinner made little sense in a city struggling to house tens of thousands of newcomers. What had once symbolized success came to represent inefficiency. This shift altered not only physical landscapes, but cultural memory. Over time, the mansions stopped being remembered as real places and became abstract ideas. They were reduced to phrases like, "once stood here," or "long demolished," turning concrete history into something almost mythical. Without living examples, it became easier to underestimate their scale and influence. In reality, these homes shaped how the Bay Area functioned at a fundamental level. They concentrated power geographically, clustering decision-makers in close proximity. Business deals, political alliances, and cultural initiatives were often negotiated within their walls. The physical closeness of elite households on hills like Nob Hill reinforced social cohesion among the wealthy, while also separating them from the rest of the city. When those homes disappeared, that geography of power dissolved. Influence became more dispersed, moving into corporate offices, financial institutions, and later, technology campuses. Power no longer needed a hilltop palace to assert itself. It could operate quietly, efficiently, and often invisibly. This transformation mirrors a broader American pattern. Unlike Europe, where aristocratic estates were often absorbed into national heritage, American wealth has tended to be more fluid and less tied to place. The Bay Area exemplifies this tendency. Fortunes rose and fell quickly, and architecture rose and fell with them. Yet, despite their disappearance, the mansions continue to exert a hold on the imagination. Part of this fascination lies in their contradiction. They were built in a region associated with opportunity and progress, yet they embodied extreme hierarchy and tradition. They borrowed heavily from European styles while standing on land recently claimed through rapid expansion and displacement. This tension makes them compelling subjects of study. They reveal how quickly new money seeks legitimacy through old forms, and how architecture becomes a tool for translating wealth into authority. The mansions were attempts to anchor identity in a landscape still defining itself. The speed with which they vanished only heightens that intrigue. In historical terms, many of these houses existed for a remarkably short time. Some stood for only a few decades, barely outlasting the people who built them. Their brief lifespan challenges the assumption that monumental architecture is inherently durable. This impermanence also complicates modern preservation debates. It forces a reckoning with the idea that not all buildings are meant to last forever, and that cities are shaped as much by loss as by survival. At the same time, it raises difficult questions about which losses are acceptable and which are irreversible mistakes. In the Bay Area, the absence of Gilded Age mansions has left room for new narratives to dominate. The region is now defined by innovation, technology, and constant reinvention. Skyscrapers and campuses project a future-oriented identity that often overlooks deeper layers of history. Yet those layers remain embedded beneath the surface. Understanding what once stood where we live and work adds complexity to that identity. It reveals that the Bay Area has always been shaped by extremes: extreme wealth, extreme growth, and extreme change. The Gilded Age was one manifestation of that pattern, not an anomaly. As interest in local history grows, these forgotten mansions serve as entry points into larger conversations. They invite reflection on land use, inequality, and cultural memory. They prompt questions about what today's landmarks say about current values, and how they might be judged by future generations. In many ways, the story of these mansions is unfinished. New discoveries continue to surface as archives are digitized and private collections made public. Old photographs reveal details previously unnoticed. Maps clarify relationships between estates and modern streets. Each fragment adds depth to a story that was once assumed complete. This ongoing process of rediscovery suggests that loss does not have to mean erasure. Even when buildings are gone, their stories can be recovered, interpreted, and shared. In doing so, the city regains some of what it lost, not in physical form, but in understanding. The forgotten Gilded Age mansions of the San Francisco Bay Area remind us that history is not always preserved by intention. Sometimes it survives through curiosity, persistence, and the refusal to let absence become silence. Their legacy lives on in the questions they raise and the insights they offer into how cities grow, forget, and remember. As the Bay Area continues to evolve, these stories provide a sense of grounding. They connect the present to a past defined by ambition and excess, creativity and contradiction. They reveal that today's landscape is not the result of inevitability, but of choices made over time. And in recognizing those choices, the city gains the opportunity to make more conscious ones in the future, deciding not only what to build next, but what to protect, what to adapt, and what stories deserve to remain visible in the places we inhabit every day. In that sense, the forgotten mansions are still shaping the Bay Area, not through walls or towers, but through memory, inquiry, and the enduring human need to understand where we came from and what we are leaving behind. As awareness of these lost mansions deepens, they begin to function less as relics of a vanished elite and more as case studies in how cities negotiate identity over time. The Bay Area, perhaps more than any other region in the United States, has built its reputation on transformation. Each economic wave has overwritten the last, leaving only fragments behind. The Gilded Age was simply one of the earliest and most dramatic examples. What makes this, Period distinct is how intentionally these families attempted to shape permanence. The mansions were not experimental or temporary structures. They were built with the assumption that their owner's status would endure indefinitely. Imported stone, old-growth timber, hand-wrought iron, and custom art were meant to defy time. In many cases, the construction techniques were sound enough that the buildings themselves could have lasted centuries. It was the context that failed them. As industries shifted and populations expanded, the logic of individual dominance over land no longer aligned with urban survival. Cities are organisms that respond to pressure. When density becomes necessary, excess space becomes negotiable. The mansions, despite their craftsmanship, occupied too much ground for too few people. This reality reframes their disappearance. They were not erased because they lacked value, but because the type of value they represented became incompatible with the city's needs. Architectural merit alone was not enough to justify their continued existence. Function, scale, and adaptability became the deciding factors. The irony is that many of these homes were adaptable in theory, but not in practice. Their layouts were highly specialized. Rooms were designed for rituals that no longer existed. Service systems assumed labor structures that had collapsed. Converting such houses required immense investment, often exceeding the cost of demolition and redevelopment. As a result, practicality won. Over time, the sites where these mansions once stood developed new identities. What had been singular landmarks became anonymous. A street corner no longer told a story of dynasty, only of traffic patterns. A hillside no longer symbolized power, only real estate value. Without context, these places lost their narrative weight. This loss of narrative is perhaps the most lasting consequence. When architecture disappears, it takes its stories with it, unless they are actively preserved. And stories untethered from place are easier to forget. This is why modern interest in these mansions often feels like an act of recovery. Researchers and enthusiasts are not just cataloging buildings, they are restoring meaning to spaces that have been flattened by time. They are asking what once happened here and why it matters. The answers complicate simple ideas of progress. They show that development is rarely neutral. Every new structure replaces something else, whether visible or invisible. The Gilded Age mansions were once replacements themselves, often built on land recently transformed by expansion and displacement. Their loss, in turn, made room for yet another layer. Seen this way, the Bay Area's history becomes a sequence of overwrites rather than a straight line. Each era leaves behind traces, but none is fully preserved. This constant reinvention fuels creativity and growth, but it also risks severing continuity. That tension is increasingly relevant today. As debates over housing, density, and preservation intensify, the story of the lost mansions offers perspective. It shows what happens when preservation comes too late, but also what happens when preservation is not aligned with social realities. It reminds us that saving buildings requires more than admiration. It requires planning, policy, and a shared belief that certain structures serve a public purpose beyond private ownership. Without that framework, even the grandest architecture is vulnerable. The Gilded Age builders assumed their wealth alone would guarantee survival. History proved otherwise. In revisiting these vanished homes, we also confront how selective memory can be. Some stories are amplified, while others fade. The mansions of the ultra-wealthy often dominate narratives of the period, but they existed alongside overcrowded neighborhoods, labor unrest, and deep inequality. Their disappearance, while architecturally tragic, also marked a shift toward a more collective use of space. This does not diminish their significance. Instead, it situates them within a broader social landscape. They were both symbols of achievement and markers of imbalance. Their loss reflects not just economic change, but cultural recalibration. What remains valuable today is the ability to hold these truths simultaneously, to admire craftsmanship without glorifying inequality, to mourn architectural loss without ignoring the forces that made it inevitable, to remember without romanticizing. The forgotten Gilded Age mansions of the San Francisco Bay Area offer this opportunity. They invite a more nuanced understanding of the past, one that acknowledges complexity rather than seeking nostalgia. As the city continues to grow upward and outward, new forms of monumentality emerge. Towers of glass replace towers of stone. Wealth expresses itself through technology campuses and financial abstractions rather than carved facades. Yet the underlying question remains the same. How will this era be remembered when its symbols are gone? The answer will depend on what stories are told, what records are kept, and what choices are made now. History is not only what survives physically, but what is actively remembered. In that sense, the story of these mansions is still being written. Each time their names are spoken, their locations mapped, or their images studied, they re-enter the city's consciousness. They become part of an ongoing conversation about identity, loss, and legacy. The Bay Area has always looked forward, but understanding what once stood behind us gives that forward motion depth. It reminds us that reinvention does not require amnesia, and that progress is strongest when it is informed by memory. The mansions may be gone, but the lessons they leave behind remain embedded in the landscape, shaping how the city grows, questions itself, and imagines what it wants to become next. As the Bay Area moves deeper into the 21st century, the distance between the present and the Gilded Age continues to widen, yet the questions raised by that era feel increasingly familiar. Wealth once again concentrates rapidly. Neighborhoods transform at astonishing speed. Land values soar, and older structures, regardless of their character, are pressured to make way for what comes next. The cycle that erased the great mansions has not ended, it has simply changed form. What distinguishes the loss of the Gilded Age mansions is how thoroughly they vanished. In many cases, there is no plaque, no marker, no public acknowledgement of what once stood there. Entire palaces were erased so completely that even longtime residents may have no idea their apartment complex or quiet street sits atop the footprint of a ballroom, gallery, or grand stair hall. This kind of disappearance creates historical blind spots. Those blind spots shape identity. When a city forgets entire layers of itself, it risks misunderstanding how it became what it is. The Bay Area is often framed as a region born fully modern, defined by technology, innovation, and constant change. The Gilded Age complicates that story. It reveals a time when the region aspired not to disrupt the old world, but to rival it. When wealth looked backward to Europe for validation, rather than forward to invention. The mansions were physical evidence of that aspiration. Their architects borrowed freely from Renaissance palaces, Gothic cathedrals, and French chateaux. Their owners filled them with old-world art, furniture, and symbolism. In doing so, they attempted to compress centuries of European prestige into a few decades of American success. That compression may be part of why the buildings felt out of place so quickly. They belonged to a vision of permanence in a city defined by volatility. Earthquakes, fires, economic swings, and demographic shifts made long-term stability elusive. The mansions were anchors dropped into fast-moving water. When those anchors failed, the city surged ahead. Yet the emotional pull of these houses remains strong. There is something compelling about structures built with such confidence, only to be undone by forces their builders could not control. They serve as reminders that wealth, like architecture, is subject to conditions beyond individual will. This recognition has reshaped how historians approach the subject. Rather than treating the mansions as isolated curiosities, they are increasingly studied as part of a broader system, linked to transportation networks, labor markets, resource extraction, and global finance. The houses were endpoints in long chains of cause and effect: gold from the mountains, silver from the Comstock lode, sugar from Hawaii, timber from old-growth forests, all converged in these buildings. Seen this way, each mansion becomes a map of the 19th century economy, translated into space and ornament. Its disappearance reflects not just local change, but the reorganization of entire industries and power structures. This systemic view also highlights voices often missing from traditional narratives. The servants who worked within these houses, the laborers who built them, and the communities displaced or excluded by their presence rarely left detailed records. When the mansions vanished, so too did opportunities to interpret those experiences through physical space. Modern efforts to reconstruct these histories face that limitation. Without buildings, interpretation relies heavily on written records created by the wealthy. The absence of architecture makes it harder to tell more inclusive stories. This is another reason the loss matters. Preservation is not only about beauty, it is about evidence. Despite this, the growing interest in lost Bay Area mansions signals a desire to confront complexity rather than simplify it. Enthusiasts are no longer content with romantic images alone. They ask difficult questions about who benefited, who was excluded, and why. The buildings were ultimately deemed expendable. This more critical engagement reflects broader changes in how history is approached. The goal is no longer to celebrate grandeur uncritically, but to understand it within context. The mansions are studied not as monuments to admire, but as artifacts to examine. In that examination, patterns emerge. Wealth concentrates, architecture responds, society adapts, and the built environment is reshaped. The same forces that produced the Gilded Age are still active today, albeit in different forms. Technology replaces railroads, venture capital replaces mining fortunes, campuses replace hilltop palaces. Future historians may look back at today's landmarks with similar questions. Why were they built so large? Why were they clustered where they were? Why did they disappear? Or why did they survive? The answers will depend on choices being made right now. This continuity gives the story of the forgotten mansions a quiet urgency. They are not just about the past. They are reference points for the present. They show what happens when speed outpaces reflection and when economic logic overrides cultural memory. At the same time, they offer reassurance. Cities endure even as buildings fall. Identity is not lost simply because structures vanish. It evolves. The Bay Area did not collapse when its mansions disappeared. It adapted, expanded, and redefined itself. But adaptation does not mean indifference. Remembering these mansions adds texture to that evolution. It allows residents to see familiar landscapes with new eyes. A hill becomes more than a view. A street becomes more than a route. A neighborhood becomes more than a collection of buildings. Each becomes part of a layered story, stretching back generations. This layered awareness enriches civic life. It encourages curiosity rather than complacency. It fosters respect for what remains and thoughtfulness about what might be lost next. In this way, the forgotten Gilded Age, mansions continue to shape the Bay Area, not through presence, but through absence. Their stories persist because they touch something universal. They remind us that success is fragile, that permanence is often an illusion, and that cities are living records of human ambition. What we build reflects who we are. What we destroy reveals what we prioritize. As the Bay Area continues its relentless transformation, the shadows of these vanished homes linger quietly beneath the surface. They do not demand restoration. They ask for recognition. And in recognizing them, the city gains a fuller understanding of itself. not just as a place of innovation and progress, but as a landscape shaped by cycles of aspiration, excess, loss, and renewal. That understanding may be the most enduring legacy the forgotten Gilded Age mansions have left behind. As these stories continue to resurface, they quietly reshape how the Bay Area is understood, not only by historians and enthusiasts, but by the people who live there every day. The land itself becomes a kind of archive. Ordinary streets, residential blocks, and commercial corridors reveal hidden histories once their past is known. What seems unremarkable at first glance becomes charged with meaning when placed against what once stood there. This is one of the lasting effects of the vanished Gilded Age mansions. They force a reconsideration of permanence. Modern cities often project an image of stability through infrastructure, zoning, and long-term planning. Yet the disappearance of entire palatial neighborhoods reminds us that even the most imposing structures exist at the mercy of forces larger than themselves. Economic shifts, natural disasters, population growth, and cultural change can erase what once seemed untouchable. In the Bay Area, this impermanence is not an exception, but a defining characteristic. From the gold rush onward, the region has been shaped by cycles of sudden expansion and reinvention. The Gilded Age mansions were products of one such cycle, born from extraordinary wealth concentrated in a short span of time. Their loss followed just as quickly when the conditions that supported them collapsed. What is striking is how completely those conditions changed. The world that produced these mansions depended on domestic service as a social norm, on slow transportation that justified proximity, and on a culture that equated visibility with authority. As these foundations eroded, the houses lost their function. No amount of ornament could compensate for a way of life that no longer existed. The servants who once maintained these vast homes became harder to hire and retain. Labor expectations shifted, social rituals grew less formal, families spent less time entertaining at home and more time in public venues. The private palace, once the center of social life, became an awkward relic of a more rigid hierarchy. At the same time, the Bay Area itself was changing demographically. Immigration, industrial growth, and later wartime expansion brought new populations with different needs and priorities. Housing shortages demanded solutions that favored density over display. Large estates became targets not because they were unloved, but because they occupied space needed by many. This is where the story of loss becomes complicated. The destruction of the mansions was not simply an act of cultural negligence. It was also a response to urgent social realities. Cities must adapt or stagnate. In adapting, they often sacrifice symbols of the past, even when those symbols are extraordinary. Yet the long-term cost of such sacrifices becomes clear only with time. Once the mansions were gone, there was no way to recover the craftsmanship, scale, and spatial imagination they represented. New buildings met immediate needs, but they did not replace what was lost in aesthetic or historical terms. The city gained capacity, but lost texture. This tension between need and memory continues to define urban development in the Bay Area. Every generation faces it anew. The difference today is awareness. The story of the Gilded Age mansions serves as a reference point, a reminder of what can vanish when preservation is absent or undervalued. In recent years, this awareness has fueled a growing interest in documentation. Photographs, maps, architectural drawings, and written accounts are treated with new urgency. They are no longer seen as curiosities, but as essential records of a vanished landscape. Through them, scholars and residents alike attempt to reconstruct not just buildings, but experiences. Descriptions of these mansions reveal environments that were immersive and overwhelming by design. Ceiling heights dwarfed the human scale. Staircases were choreographed to impress. Light was filtered through stained glass, reflected off polished surfaces, and manipulated to create drama. Sound echoed differently in rooms designed to amplify presence. Even silence carried weight. These sensory qualities are difficult to convey without physical space, yet they are central to understanding why these houses mattered. They were not merely large. They were environments engineered to communicate power, refinement, and control. Walking through them reinforced social order at every turn. When such spaces disappear, that social language disappears with them. Modern buildings communicate differently. They prioritize efficiency, flexibility, and neutrality. While these values are practical, they rarely inspire awe. The emotional register of the city shifts accordingly. This shift is neither entirely positive nor entirely negative. It reflects changing values. The Bay Area today places greater emphasis on accessibility, innovation, and adaptability than on hierarchy and permanence. The built environment mirrors those priorities. Glass towers, open-plan offices, and modular housing speak a different architectural language than carved stone and gilded wood. Still, the fascination with the lost mansions suggests something unresolved. People are drawn to what is gone precisely because it represented a form of ambition that feels absent today. Not ambition in terms of profit or scale, but ambition in craft, detail, and experiential richness. This does not mean there is a desire to return to the inequalities of the Gilded Age. Rather, there is a recognition that something valuable existed alongside those inequalities. A belief that buildings could aspire to artistry as well as function. The mansions embodied that belief, even if they did so in an exclusionary context. As modern architects and planners grapple with sustainability, density, and affordability, the lessons of the past gain relevance. The question becomes not whether to replicate Gilded Age grandeur, but how to integrate meaning, beauty, and longevity into contemporary design without repeating old mistakes. The story of these mansions encourages that conversation. It shows what happens when architecture is allowed to pursue excellence without restraint, and what happens when it is later judged incompatible with evolving needs. It challenges the assumption that usefulness and beauty must exist in opposition. Another enduring impact of the lost mansions lies in how they shaped historical imagination. Without surviving examples, the Gilded Age in the Bay Area risks being overshadowed by narratives centered elsewhere, particularly in the eastern United States. The absence of physical landmarks makes it harder to assert the region's role in that era on a national stage. Yet the Bay Area's Gilded Age was no less significant. Its fortunes were tied to global trade, resource extraction, and transportation networks that reshaped the American economy. The mansions were visible endpoints of those systems. Their loss does not diminish that importance, but it does require greater effort to remember it. This effort often begins at the local level. Community historians, preservationists, and residents uncover stories connected to specific sites. They trace property records, study old photographs, and compare maps across decades. In doing so, they reconstruct a city that exists only in fragments. These reconstructions are acts of imagination grounded in evidence. They do not recreate the past as it was lived, but they restore awareness of what once occupied familiar ground. This awareness transforms how people move through the city. A walk becomes a dialogue between past and present. Such dialogue is essential in a region defined by rapid change. Without it, transformation risks becoming erasure. With it, change can be contextualized, understood as part of a longer continuum rather than a clean break. The forgotten Gilded Age mansions of the San Francisco Bay Area occupy a unique place in that continuum. They were built quickly, flourished briefly, and disappeared decisively. Few architectural movements leave such a concentrated trace of ambition, followed by such complete absence. Their story resists simple conclusions. It is not merely a warning against excess, nor a lament for lost beauty. It is a case study in how cities respond to shifting realities, and how architecture serves both as expression and casualty of those shifts. In the end, the value of remembering these mansions lies not in mourning what cannot be recovered, but in understanding what their rise and fall reveal about the forces that continue to shape urban life. Wealth will always seek expression. Cities will always adapt. Buildings will always be judged by standards that change over time. What endures is the need to ask questions before choices become irreversible. What do we value in our built environment? What deserves care beyond immediate utility? And how will future generations interpret the decisions being made now? The lost mansions cannot answer these questions directly, but their absence gives them weight. They stand as reminders that every city is temporary in form, even when it feels permanent in the moment. And in that reminder, the forgotten Gilded Age mansions of the San Francisco Bay Area continue to fulfill a purpose they were never designed for. Not as homes for the powerful, but as silent teachers, revealing how ambition, beauty, and impermanence are woven together in the life of a city.